Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to my YouTube today. My name is Chris, and our film today is based on an event that took place from RAF Bolt Head in 1942. In fact, it was September the 26th, 1942. And it's reported, and I read directly from the operational record book for RAF Bolt Head, and here it clearly states that at 1200 hours, 2 squadrons of Spitfires landed, which was 401 Squadron and 133 Eagle Squadron. These were refueled and all sorts of other bits and pieces carried out, and they later took off on an operational flight. This was 23 machines in all, and only one squadron returned. One machine of 133 Squadron, which was a Spitfire Mark IX, landed near Kingsbridge, and the pilot was Pilot Officer Beaty. He was slightly injured. One pilot of 401 Squadron, Pilot Officer Hokan, bailed out over the sea and is reported to be missing. Sergeant Wright of 401 Squadron crashed near Torquay. The remainder of 133 Squadron, 11 pilots and 11 aircraft, are reported to be missing. And that was taken from the operational record book of RAF Bolt Head for that day, the 26th of September 1942, and this is by way of an introduction to my film about this mission. Now, events took place some days before the fateful day of the 26th of September, and on the 23rd of September 1942, 133 Squadron moved from Beacon Hill to Great Sampford in Essex. And it was at this point they swapped their Mark V Spitfires for brand new Mark IX Spitfires with considerably improved performance, especially at altitude. Unfortunately, the 133 Squadron pilots were not to enjoy their Mark IX Spitfires for very long. It was really a tragic event that took place. 133 Squadron was the main victim of the tragic so-called Morlaix disaster, which virtually wiped out the unit on the 26th of September 1942. It had been arranged a fighter escort force of 3 Spitfire squadrons, 133, which were the Eagle Squadron, made up mainly of American servicemen, 401 Royal Canadian Air Force Squadron from Kenley, and 64 Squadron from Hornchurch. Their task was to escort US AAF B-17s on a daylight bombing raid on Morlaix, Brittany, France. The force of Spitfires was to have been led by Kenley wing leader, Wing Commander Brian Kingham, but he was delayed, and the lead of the fighter escort was given to Officer Commanding 64 Squadron, Australian Squadron Leader Tony Gaze. Kingham eventually caught up and led 401 Squadron. Meanwhile, the commanding officer of 133 Squadron, American Red McCoplin, had been ordered to go to London to be sworn in as a major in the United States Army Air Force. 133 Squadron were therefore being led by one of the flight commanders, who was a British RAF serviceman, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Brettell. On the morning of the 26th of September 1942, the 3 Spitfire squadrons deployed to RAF Bolt Head in South Devon to refuel and to brief on the mission. The sortie briefing led the Spitfire pilots to expect little cloud and strong headwinds outbound. In the event, when they were over the channel, they encountered heavy cloud cover obscuring the ground features, and unknown to them at the time, a 100-mile-per-hour tailwind, which blew the formation much further south than intended and out of radio contact with the controllers at RAF Exeter in England. On returning, into the headwind with fuel running low, navigating by dead reckoning alone above 10/10th cloud cover. The timing suggested that they should be approaching the British coastline. The American pilots of 133 Squadron spotted what they thought was the English coastline through a gap in the clouds and descended beneath it, despite being told by squadron leader Gaze not to do so. Unfortunately, they were over Brest, and 133 Squadron Spitfires were subjected to all that the German defences could throw at them. 133 Squadron lost 11 of their 12 brand new Mark IX Spitfires. The 12th Spitfire crash-landed on the south coast of England in Kingsbridge, Devon. Completely out of fuel, he had turned back early with engine problems. 4 of the American Eagle Squadron pilots were killed, 6 became POWs, and 1, Officer Robert E. Smith, bailed out and evaded capture, eventually returning to England via Spain. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Petrol was one of those captured. He later took part in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944, but was one of the men recaptured and subsequently shot by the Gestapo. 3 of 401 Squadron Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfires also failed to return, but the remainder of the wing, including all of 64 Squadron Spitfires led by Tony Gaze, reached RAF Bolt Head safely, but in many cases only just. As we know, a total of 14 Spitfire Mark IXs were shuttled down to RAF Bolt Head near Salcombe in Devon, in readiness, of which only 12 were eventually required for the mission. 1 pilot from each flight, Irvin Dusty Miller and Don Buckeye Gentile, were ordered to remain on the ground. They were rather put out by this news, having been keen to see how the new Spitfires would perform against the FW-190s, but dutifully they watched their squadron take off into low cloud. Gentile and Miller waited. They waited some more. Eventually they heard approaching aircraft, but these proved to be the Mark Vs of 401 Squadron, which were also deployed on the mission. They were almost out of fuel and had seen neither the Flying Fortresses or the Mark IXs in the impenetrable cloud. Very, very clearly something had gone disastrously wrong. Word reached RAF Bolt Head that one of the Eagle Squadron Spitfires had crash-landed on the coast just a few miles away. This turned out to be one of the 12 machines that were only one of the 12 machines that were ever seen again. The official squadron diary recorded this: the 12 aircraft took off with 401 Squadron to make a rendezvous with the Flying Fortresses in mid-channel, at a point approximately halfway between Bolt Head and Morlaix. It is not clear as to what exactly happened, but some of the fortresses were seen after our aircraft had been flying for 45 minutes. The pilot of one aircraft, Pilot Officer Beaty, alone returned from this operation, and owing to a petrol shortage, crash-landed in a small field near Kingsbridge, Devon. From his account and what he overheard on the radio, it seems probable that the rest of the squadron force-landed on the Isle of Ouissant on the French mainland. It transpired that this was a rather optimistic view of the outcome. Following a strenuous board of inquiry, it became clear that 133 Squadron had never broken free of the cloud and was thus unaware of the fact that the northeasterly wind was blowing at 100 knots instead of the predicted 35. The increase in wind speed had been recorded but not communicated effectively to the squadrons. With no reference points to call upon, the flight leader, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Petrol, called for the directions home and received a heading back to base from Morlaix, rather than from where he actually was located. The fortresses were equally lost and equally far off course. When they broke free of the cloud, they found themselves over the Pyrenees. They turned around and slogged it back to Britain, being more grateful for the cloud cover than on their outbound leg. Meanwhile, having followed the prescribed heading for what was deemed the correct amount of time, Petrol was closed up to the formation, and they dropped out of the cloud to see what they all assumed was the British coastline. While looking for landmarks, the squadron passed over a large town and immediately found themselves in a barrage of anti-aircraft fire that destroyed one Spitfire and damaged several others before the defending F1W-190s swept in to savage them. They had in fact made their way to the Germans' prized port of Brest, one of the most heavily defended areas of the French coast. German sources reported all 12 of the Spitfires were shot down. Actually, there was only 11 that was shot down, and the sole 133 Squadron Spitfire managed to get away, that of pilot officer Bob Beaty. He had turned back somewhat earlier after suffering a misfire. Beaty made landfall in Devon by luck alone after gliding into the coast when his fuel ran out and he crash landed near the town of Kingsbridge. One of the other pilot officer, Robert Smith, made it back to Britain on foot after passing through France and into Spain undetected. 6 pilots were killed in action and eventually 4 were taken POW. On the 29th of March 1944, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Brattell was one of the officers involved in the Great Escape. Very sadly, he was later recaptured and summarily executed by the Gestapo. The element of surprise that was hoped for the Spitfire Mark IXs had been lost, as well as some of the most valuable combat experience available to the fledgling United States Army Air Force. 3 days after the Brest raid, 133 Squadron transferred to American command with a complement of earlier Spitfire 5Bs, and following the Board of Inquiry, those ground controllers and Met officers who were responsible for the mission found themselves posted to the worst available hellholes in the Far East and North Africa as a penance for their sins. Thank you very, very much for watching along so far. It's been an interesting an account to relate of what happened to those brave pilots as they crossed the English Channel back in September 1942. Do have a ponder about subscribing. It would be really much appreciated and helps a lot in sharing this film around. I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. All the very best. Take care. Cheers for now.